Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. I'm Stephen. What is a mystic? What is mysticism? What is the mystical? Even in our 24/7 social media drenched, junked up internet world of money, career and self-promotion, many of us have a sense that there is something mysterious underpinning things, some countercultural force that defies explanation. And Simon Critchely, my guest in this episode of The Bureau, has written a book on mysticism, the experience of ecstasy, suggesting that mystical experiences offer a practical way to deepen the sense of our lives, whether through mainstream connections and religion or by taking part in mind-altering experiences of different kinds. But the interesting thing about this book is that Simon is a philosopher, and philosophy, along with much modern science and many modern religions, has poo-pooed the mystical, relegated it to the woo-woo, the superstitious, of interest only to the less sophisticated or mad. It's a bit embarrassing. We once thought the earth was flat, but now we know better. And all mysteries will one day be solved, understood by science. It's just a matter of time, right? And yet that actually is quite different than our experience. So welcome, mystics and skeptics, rational believers, unbelievers, to the Bureau of Lost Culture, where we've been trying to uncover the mystery of that mysterious thing called counterculture. You can check out over 100 attempts to do so at bureauoflostculture.com. And thanks to Jonah, Polly, Paddy, Pete, Richard and Dinah for writing to help me out by suggesting further lines of inquiry. You can join them too. We always love to hear from people. And it was great to hear from Simon Critchely, Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York, and to talk about his book and to talk about the mystics which he covers, 16 of them actually, including Christina the Astonishing in 1150 to 1120-24, who woke up at her own funeral, rose into the air, later ate only garbage and threw herself in the freezing River Meuse. There was also Julian of Norwich, Master Icart, and many others, but we also got into people like Nick Cave, and in fact we digressed around all sorts of subjects, including sex, drugs and rock and roll, William Blake, the COVID pandemic, and Wim Wenders. So here we go. Welcome, Simon Critchley, philosopher and the author of this book. Welcome, Simon, to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Very, very pleased to be here.
Well, you're giggling there when I've described you as a philosopher. Is that a funny thought then, the idea of yourself as a philosopher?
Imposter syndrome. Yeah. It makes it seem as if I have some grand theories and so on and so forth, and I'm reluctant to embrace that, as I indeed am reluctant to embrace the fact that I'm a professor, because it seems too lofty and self-serving. So that's why I giggle.
I've given a little bit of information about you and your work in the intro, but rather than me make you giggle again, why don't you tell us who Simon Critchley is?
So I teach philosophy in New York. I've been here for 21 years. I like living in New York because, I can do my academic stuff and then leave the building and do something else. So you're not, stuck on a campus with a bunch of miserable, depressed academics, which tends to be the case. So what I'm proud of are the books I've written, but the topics I end up writing on are things which reflect my passions and interests.
You've covered all sorts of stuff, from Beckham to baldness.
Both bald in the sense of actually being bald, and bald in the sense of speaking plainly.
Yeah,
and then, a book on Bowie, who was not bald.
No, Bowie had excellent hair, didn't he?
Thick, lustrous hair. My mother always thought it was a wig.
We were sort of hoping it was a wig, weren't we? Because how can you be so talented, so good looking, right, so charismatic, and have great hair? It's just like, that's not right,
It's really not fair, and I still resent him for that. And so I've been trying to, write in relationship to my passions, as it were.
So in your latest book on mysticism, the experience of ecstasy, is what we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing for me, just in terms of counterculture, is the mystical as a human experience as a human expression has always seemed somewhat countercultural. I'm not talking about the 50s, 60s and 70s here. I'm talking about right back in time, as your book covers. Is there something in that, you think? There is something fundamentally rotating against the mainstream culture about?
Yes, I would say. Let's pick some examples. Francis of Assisi was a heretic. You don't get to replicate the stigmata of Christ and wander around with these visions of brother, sun, sister, moon, and to give up the idea of personal property and everything else that the Franciscans associated with. And that was a countercultural movement. And then the Catholic Church had to organize their response to it. Because I think the other side to mysticism, it's countercultural, I would say, yeah. And it's also a tradition which has been popular. And the reason why we have the vast majority of the books that we have and texts that we have is because these texts were copied, recopied, circulated, translated, retranslated, and they just were passed around in an informal way. So there is I think, a strongly countercultural dimension to what we call mysticism. And there are tons of other examples. Informal groups of semi-enclosed men and women, beguines and begars, judged to be outside the confines of the church largely. And there are one or two, notable torchings of mystics. Marguerite Perret is burnt at the stake in 1310 in Paris for refusing to retract her book on refined love called The Mirror of Simple and Annihilated Souls. And she goes to her death with the book in her hand. She refuses to retract it. Now, what worried the church wasn't so much her, was the fact that she was getting this huge audience, that whatever the message that she had, it was wildfire.
Right. And of course, at times, but all the churches, not just the Christian church, but the other religions too, have been brutal towards their own mystics, haven't they? I mean, at times they've kind of tolerated them, at times they maybe even celebrated them or admired them, but at other times they have been ruthless in their attempts to eradicate the mystical.
It's a strategy of either containment or expulsion. Groups like the Free Spirit become expelled from mainstream Christianity. So it's similar stories could be told about people like Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, the Alumbrados in the Iberian Peninsula, and they are contained in the church, but clearly they're trouble church authorities, not continuously, but certainly from the 11th, 12th century, wants to really organize Christianity around law, institutions, the authority of the church, making sure that everybody's on message. And that means it's repressive of anything that doesn't line up with that. The vast majority of people that we think of as mystics did not see themselves as heretics. On the contrary, they saw themselves as contemplatives, trying to create more contemplative communities. They saw themselves as what we would call spiritual, but not in any way as weird or strange. And this is the twist in the countercultural narrative. They didn't see themselves as opposing the mainstream culture. They saw themselves as very much trying to hang on to what was true and essential to it. Right. But often they were pushed out by that mainstream culture and declared to be beyond the pale.
They didn't really see themselves as mystics either.
No.
I mean, that notion of the mystic is quite a bit more recent. I think you date it to sort of back to the 17th century. And of course, I said it many times on this show, it's important not to sort of set the counterculture and the mainstream culture against each other. They need each other. You don't have to be an enemy of the mainstream culture to be countercultural.
Mysticism really is a 19th century term. The term le mystique in French appears in the 17th century at the point when extreme experiences that people were having then become called mystical and then retrospectively project onto a past that did not see it in those terms. The twist in that is that there's also an idea of mystikos in Greek as the hidden or the secret. And that goes back to the mystical theology of Dionysius. That arguably goes back thousands of years. The sacred is linked to something where you have to keep a secret, keep your eyes and mouth shut.
And in that respect, it shares something in common, doesn't it, with the occult? And because occult also really, its meaning is nothing to do with devils or even magic really, but just means secret, doesn't it? Hidden.
Yeah. Basically, what happens in the Reformation is that all of those experiences that, say, a Teresa of Avila was having, levitating, direct visual experiences of the Virgin Mary or of Christ, those things become treated with increasing suspicion after the Reformation, because the effect of Luther and Calvin is that our access to religion is scripture alone and faith alone. Experiences of transport, visitation, levitation, bilocation, all those things then reappear as something demonic and strange. 17th century, you begin to get witch trials, became the United States in Salem. And after the Reformation, anything which has the appearance of the visionary and the ecstatic and of that form then gets branded as the demonic. And then the occult kind of, latches onto that set of ideas.
Certainly with the Catholic Church, even when it's treated so-called mystics harshly, it's always had a bent for the mystical. I mean, I grew up in a sort of very Catholic context. I think even a couple of years ago, there was a finger of a saint was touring the UK. Right. Some relic of some long dead saint. I think my mum actually went to see it, or I'm not even to touch it, I'm not quite sure. And of course, Lourdes itself, mysterious healings at Lourdes, they've still got this kind of mysterious, you might call it, I suppose, but mystical aspect to it. They haven't completely given up on that.
No, it's very important that the relationship to devotional objects, that also is a casualty of the Reformation. After Luther sets off the Reformation, and he realizes that the shit is really hitting the fan in the German-speaking lands, and the churches are being torched and torn to pieces, and he's appalled by this. Has to come up with a view that what do we do with religious objects, icons, relics, and so on and so forth. And he says these are things of indifference to faith, but he doesn't think they should be smashed to pieces. They should just be treated with indifference. And that fundamentally misses a deep truth about religion, which goes back, I think, for as long as there have been hominids, that we have an intense attachment to things, and certain things having certain powers, which, if we can communicate, touch those things, revere those things, then something of that power might be transmitted through us. If I participate in a ritual and tie a ribbon around a column, I saw this in Greece a long time ago, tying a ribbon around a column, this might lead to my family member recovering from a severe illness or a fever or something like that. And then the church authorities and then the secular world says, well, that's just nonsense and balderdash, and that's claptrap. And what that misses is the fact that we need certain things to have a value which contains within them the possibility of help, the possibility that we could be consoled and lifted, and particularly within the medieval Christian worldview, a part comes to represent the whole, so that Christ's finger or a saint's tooth, which is just a tooth, can be seen to incarnate the entirety of the divine.
On the subject of relics, because a friend of mine recently who tours Europe looking at Christian churches, particularly to do with death, but she was telling me recently about a place where there is Jesus's foreskin. Right. And that's slightly comical and weird. But what's even weirder is that there are 4 places where there are Jesus's foreskin. Yeah. But she was making the point that actually that didn't matter. It wasn't actually the question about, well, which one's real, or any of them real, or in fact, are any of them a foreskin? Mm-hmm. The point was actually people's connection with the object, which acted as a totem in some way to make them feel connected with a bigger truth than themselves.
That's exactly how it is. Yeah. So, and we approach things like Christ's foreskin with the spectacles of, an empirical scientist. And we want to say, we have this very kind of old-fashioned, as it were, a wrong idea of proof, simple empirical proof. And then we want to say, well, this is just all hocus pocus and smoke and mirrors. But it misses the point. It misses the point that there could be foreskins of Christ in 4 locations, and they could all be serving a purpose for the groups that go to visit those churches. And there's nothing wrong with that. Judging religion by the standards of empirical verification mean that you're never going to understand what religion is about and how it works. You have to approach religion, I think, sympathetically, and, if you like, more anthropologically, rather than as a scientifically minded skeptic. 'Cause you're not going to see what people are doing when they're doing religion, and that's the side of it that interests me. It's not often, it will be reduced to, what do you believe? Do you believe in the existence of God or not? I don't even think that matters. It's a question of what you do, what the practices are that you're engaged in, what the acts are, and that's and when you're engaged in those acts, then that's enough. That's what ritual does, and I think that's really important and needs to be held on to.
You're possibly reluctantly a philosopher, a thinker. You teach philosophy, okay? But it seemed to me that philosophy, as well as scientists, have treated the mystical with some disdain, right?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah.
Right, so it's anti-rational, it's anti-secular. Mm-hmm. You can maybe throw it in the bag with magical thinking. It's decried it, it's denied it. What you've done, or what you've attempted to do with this book, actually, is to rectify that in some way, to say, no, we can actually take it very seriously, and we can regard it as something which is fundamentally human and fundamentally important. But don't try and analyse it with science. Don't try and analyze it maybe even with traditional philosophy.
That's absolutely right. I mean, I've been trying to piss off mainstream academic philosophy in whatever way I can, and mysticism is a really good strategy to take. Because if you say, someone could give a lecture where I work, and a response could be, well, that's just mysticism, and that's it. It's refuted. It's gone. That's just mystical. What does that mean? So it's a term of abuse that's woefully short-sighted. And so another thing that I'm really attacking is secular, rational, critical worldview that I was educated within in British philosophy. Philosophy as a kind of protective thing against all of that mystical religious nonsense. And firstly, it's wrong. It's a very narrow conception of what philosophy does. It has no way of understanding what philosophy has been for the millennia of its history. Where if you look at, I don't know, Plato or even Aristotle, the goal of philosophy, or Epicurus, the goal of philosophy was something like divine life. We've constructed in the modern era an incredibly narrow conception of philosophy, passive-aggressive idea of philosophy, and anything that doesn't match up to that is just considered to be nonsense. We think it's our duty to convey that to students and turn them into critical rationalists. There's a much more fecund and richer field of experience.
The traditional philosophy, and of course the scientific view of the world, fundamentally denies how most people experience the world. If I sit on the shore here and watch the sun rising, it might be kind of joyful experience, or a kind of, a breathing in, an inhalation, an inspiration of some sort. Most of us, really appreciate the sun rising, but we know the sun isn't rising. It's the earth is spinning. The fact that it's actually the earth is turning, not the sun rising, doesn't affect the poetic experience of watching the sunrise. There's a mystical experience for most of us. The fact that it's the earth turning, and you can explain it in terms of what the atoms in the molecules in the air are doing and why it looks those colours, doesn't impact your experience of it, right?
In terms of how the world appears to us, shows up to us, the world as a meaningful world, that doesn't mean that modern physics is wrong at all. It means that modern physics is secondary to that experience of you on the shore watching the sunrise. That's how things show up first and foremost. If we can peel off our intellectualist, narrow, rationalistic idea of what we should be thinking, and just learn to be with the things that we're with, then what we find, I think, is a very everyday ecstasy.
Here is a sidebar about the film My Dinner with Andre. Imagine a feature-length film which is just two friends in a Manhattan restaurant talking. That's what My Dinner with Andre, the Louis Malle film from 1981, is about. And trust me, if you haven't seen it, it's way more fascinating than it sounds. I would say it's a one-off, a significant countercultural work. It's this single conversation taking place during dinner where the contrast between mystical experience and ordinary life becomes an exploration of human existence. First up, we've got Andre Gregory, the ultimate spiritual seeker, a kind of elite, posh, rich guy who's always chasing some kind of profound experience. Since he and Wally last met, he's been on a kind of odyssey. We're talking about being buried alive in theatrical workshops in Poland, this is the 70s, mystical moments in the Sahara Desert, and spiritual retreats up here in Findhorn. Adventures that seem to exist at the edges of human experience, or sound like they're straight out of a spiritual travel documentary. Andre's big beef is that most of us are basically zombies. We wake up, go to work, watch TV, sleep, repeat. He believes we're so caught up in our routines that we've forgotten how to truly experience life. It's like we're wearing blinkers, missing out on the magical, mystical, transformative moments happening all around us. He describes a profound dissatisfaction with a life lived through other people's expectations, media, and social conditioning. But then there's Wallace Shawn. You might remember him from The Princess Bride, also a great film. Wally, the ultimate everyday hero. Whereas Andre is all about breaking free from routine, Wally's basically saying, you know what, my comfortable bed, talking with my girlfriend Debbie and having morning coffee, amazing things. He's not trying to have some massive spiritual experience. He's finding joy in simple stuff. Andre shares his incredible stories about trying to wake up from what he calls the nightmare of civilization, while Wally listens, challenges him, and offers a completely different perspective.
I mean, really, tell me, why do we require a trip to Mount Everest in order to be able to perceive one moment of reality? I mean, is Mount Everest more real than New York? I mean, isn't New York real? I mean, you see, I think if you could become fully aware of what existed in the cigar store next door to this restaurant, I think it would just blow your brains out. I mean, isn't there just as much reality to be perceived in the cigar store as there is on Mount Everest? I mean, what do you think? You see, I think that not only is there nothing more real about Mount Everest, I think there's nothing that different in a certain way. I mean, because reality is uniform in a way, so that if your perceptions are, if your own mechanism is operating correctly, it would become irrelevant to go to Mount Everest and sort of absurd because, of course, on some level, obviously it's very different from a cigar store on 7th Avenue.
Well, I agree with you, Wally. But the problem is that people can't see the cigar store now. Things don't affect people the way they used to. It may very well be that 10 years from now, people will pay $10,000 in cash to be castrated just in order to be affected by something.
Well, why do you think that is?
And what makes the film so brilliant, I think, is that it's not about who's right. It's not about Andre versus Wally in some philosophical wrestling match. Instead, it's this wonderful exploration of different ways of living. Andre shows that there is magic beyond everyday experience, and Wally reminds us that there's also magic in everyday experience. Andre's mystical experiences are fascinating, but kind of exhausting, while Wally's ordinary life is comfortable, but a bit limiting. The movie basically asks, what does it mean to be alive? Is it chasing extraordinary experiences like Andre? Or finding extraordinary moments in life like Wally does? The answer, it turns out, might be a bit of both. My Dinner with Andre isn't just a movie. It really challenged me when I first saw it, and I watch it periodically just to remind myself and ask the question, am I really awake? Am I truly experiencing the world, or just moving through it?
So ecstasy isn't some rarefied experience that's had, with the right mixture of drugs and alcohol or whatever it might be. It could be that, but I think we inhabit the world ecstatically, but we cover that over with the patina of a kind of a narrow scientific rationalism.
To use some of the ways that you describe mysticism yourself, experience of heightening one's senses and sense and self into a sheer feeling of aliveness, that often that means the expansion of one's sense of self and a feeling of connectedness, doesn't it, with either other people, other selves, or something much bigger, which you might describe as God or not.
Exactly, which you might describe as God or not. Exactly, yeah.
Right, and this is not a self-help book, I should drop that in right now, but you do see that embracing process can refresh our thinking, help us live deeper and freer lives.
Yeah.
You've got your 16 favourite mystics, which you talk about, these people, these characters that in some way have evoked that, but in particular for you. For me, there were people like Blake, William Blake's very down-to-earth London Cockney visionary evocation of the mystic.
I visited his grave 2 weeks ago when I was back in London, Bunhill Fields Cemetery. That was rather lovely. Blake is a very good example of a kind of everyday artisanal kind of mystic. He did see angels in the trees at Peckham Rye when he was a kid. What I'm trying to target in the book is doubt and melancholy, and trying to find ways of thinking about the mystical authors that interest me most, like Julian of Norwich, as ways of pushing against self-doubt and pushing against the melancholy and misery with which we're all too familiar. So there is, to that extent, I think there is a consolation in mysticism, which would like to convey. Whether that makes the book help in some way, I hope so.
When I visited Blake's grave in Bunhill Fields, and one of the wonderful things about it in terms of what we've just been discussing is that every time I've been there, there's flowers on the grave, there's other objects on the grave. People treat it mystically. This stone in this little cemetery in central London.
About 20 years ago, I was staying in not far from Bunhill Fields, and my son, who must have been 15 at the time, we're walking to Liverpool Street Station to get the train to Colchester, and I said, I'm going to take you to see William Blake's grave. He said, who's William Blake? So I explained who William Blake was. We're walking into Bunhill Fields Cemetery, and there were these people around the grave, and I thought, that's Patti Smith. And it was Patti Smith with a film crew. And she was doing a documentary. I think she was curating the Meltdown, a London Meltdown Festival that year. So I said to my son, that's Patti Smith. So he said, who's Patti Smith? So I began to talk about Patti Smith. But there was Patti Smith, giving some reverence to William Blake, one of her inspirations. So that's lovely. That's also, Blake as a countercultural figure.
For Ginsberg, Blake was a major, touchstone too. That brings me into counterculture, or just the culture, the arts. Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about tying a ribbon around a column in Greece with the hope, with the intention, with the propitiation that it might cure a sick relative. We were at Epidavros in summer. The thing about Epidavros in the temple of Asclepius is that when people went to be healed, yes, they got herbal drinks, they might even get operated on, they would get exercise regimes. But part of the healing, part of the treatment was the theatre and comedy.
Yeah.
The arts, right? The mystical and the culture interact.
It's a very interesting thing in the Greek context that the theatre and the hospital are next door to each other. It's also true in Athens, the Theatre of Dionysus on the south slope of the Acropolis. There's an Asclepion next to that.
I mean, of course, they talked about it, catharsis, right? The idea that witnessing something, which has been played out, a story played out in front of you, can, in some sense, on a kind of visceral level, have a kind of cleansing or a kind of, a therapeutic effect on the soul. And of course, a lot of illnesses are psychosomatic, aren't they? They are to do with the soul as well as physical. That was the thing which I didn't mention in terms of Asclepius, is that the god appeared to people in their dreams. Or if you were lucky enough that the god did appear in your dreams, that could be the route to your healing.
So that's very important. The other side of the theatre and healing, the connection of that to the democratic city. The Athenians invent theatre, comedy, satyr play, and tragedy, and then they also invent democracy and the institutions connected with democracy, the council, the pnyx, where the law was decided upon, and so on and so forth. And the third thing is the mysteries. Really important place is the mysteries of Elefsis and Elefsina, where people were engaged for a whole series of days, 8 days, 9 days, in probably around September, and various offerings were given, and then they went off along the sacred way, which went from the heart of the city of Athens to Elefsis, and those people were mysti. They were mystics, and what they did, we don't know, because they were sworn to secrecy, and that's that secrecy pact was maintained, and that existed for what, at least 1,000 years. If we think about society, and think about that in relationship to something like ancient Greece, we have art, tragedy, we have healing, the hospital, we have the political institutions of the city, and we have the rituals of the mysteries, and and all those things are essential for social form to work.
Circling back, through via the arts, we don't need to glorify the mystical in terms of wild out there experiences, which of course are there. We all experience it, don't we? Some transcendental moment when you're listening to music. I mean, rock and roll can be mystical, right? It can be cathartic. It can be ecstatic. Particularly maybe it's included with dancing and drugs, possibly. But when I was reading your book, I suddenly thought, I'm not a massive Doors fan, but I was thinking, Jim Morrison, sort of seemed to embody that, didn't he? Somehow, break on through to the other side, and Riders on the Storm, what a figure, and you talk about Nick Cave, right? In that way too. It's with us, isn't it? It's not something of the past and just of the saints and the Greeks. No, it's right right now.
Yeah, Jim Morrison was, kind of a shaman, obviously, and he knew his Blake and his Rimbaud and all of that. And he was, I'm particularly interested in, Nick Cave because I'm a fan, but I also saw the birthday party in 1981, and best band I ever saw live. And so watching the kind of development of his work over the decades is fascinating. And I had the chance to talked to him about 6 months ago, and the relationship to religion is very serious, it's very earnest, and I think, as he said, his concerts are like going to church. On the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, it's a sad thing. It's just that all that remains of church for us is music. Music is the kind of the last kind of fag end of that set of experiences that would have been held in a larger institutional framework. We have music, and that's great. And the argument of the book is that it's impossible to be an atheist when you're listening to the music that you love. So when you're listening to that, or you're asking someone else to listen to it with you, you believe and you want them to believe. That endures, and that's wonderful. But maybe that's all we have.
We've had those moments at concerts, and it reminded me too, because you've also talked a bit about film, cinema as a kind of temple in some respects as well. And of course, in that film, Wings of Desire, where the birthday party appeared, that is a kind of mystical film, isn't it?
There's 2 stills from Wim Wenders' Wings of Desire in the book, I think. Certainly there's one of Nick Cave, and there's another one of the Angel.
The Angel, yeah.
Bruno Ganz, isn't it, the actor? And the angel that, and this all comes out of Wim Wenders' reading of Rilke, and the idea that what would you say to an angel, or what would an angel be interested in? And an angel wouldn't be interested in angelic things because they've been familiar with that for eternity. But an angel might be interested in coffee or a cigarette, and going to see a band. That's really interesting for an angel. So in a sense, it flips around the whole issue of, and angels are, are very important figures. They're mediators and messengers, and they might be flying around here. Who knows? Maybe in Findhorn for sure. I'm sure there's a whole.
There is the Angel of Findhorn. It's funny as you mentioned that's the Angel of Findhorn is the kind of latest incarnation, or the latest metaphor for some sense that there's been here of the other. It appeared first of all in the late 50s as extraterrestrials, then it morphed into, people talked about Dave as nature spirits, who helped the gardens here grow. Now they talk about it more as the angel of Findhorn, a kind of inspiring spirit of the place. I love the way that you've connected all these people, from figures in the past and figures in the present. And the Nick Cave thing reminded me that he's suffered a lot, hasn't he? He's had two of his sons have died, both in quite tragic circumstances. Pain, suffering, could be like, extreme physical deprivation of some sort, or psychological, emotional pain in some ways, also is a route to the mystical.
Yes, from always, if we think about the Desert Fathers, St. Anthony, and through to the medieval mystics, yes, it's suffering and pain and wounding, and the wanting to be wounded and the wanting to suffer. That, a great example is Julian of Norwich, and Julian, at the age of 30 and a half, says that I wished for 3 wounds of contrition, compassion, and suffering, like the suffering of our Lord. And so she wants to undergo sympathetically the crucifixion, and she gets her wish, and she's dying. And it's at the point where she's dying and the parson has been brought in, and a boy is with the parson. The boy is holding a crucifix. The crucifix begins to bleed, and then she begins to experience revelations, but only for about 12 hours, 11, 12 hours. So it's the condition for revelation and showing is pain and suffering. And that's a difficult message to, like I'm telling people to go and suffer. The context that the book came out of was COVID and the pandemic. Right. And where I was living in New York, people were dying in significant numbers in nursing homes very close to where I live. And so there's that feeling of suffering, mortality, pain, and all of that, and the fear of getting that virus and dying yourself. But also in that, there is an extraordinary desire for connection, for love. There's a whole story about the correlation between mysticism and plague, but the idea that the experiences of pestilence awaken something really archaic within us, that there is, for as long as there have been human beings, there have been diseases that have wiped those human beings out, and the fears and hopes that accompany that. So in a sense, the pandemic was, amongst other things, a kind of reminder of something very old about us and what we do. I think that's terribly important. We get lost in the, not so much short-term thinking, but I think middle-term thinking, 10, 15 years down the road thinking. And, and that space has been occupied by futurologists peddling various, certainties about what the world's going to look like, all of which usually turn out to be wrong. Actually, we're not that different from people that were living in Epidaphros. We have the same needs and the same wants, and we suffer in the same way. There is something deeply old about us which needs to be recognized before we throw that away.
And that plague certainly revealed our vulnerability and gave us an opportunity, a window to change, which we didn't take largely. We sort of went back to normal. But it isn't right to suggest that, we'll go out and suffer as a way to become more mystical. That's kind of silly, isn't it? But the outliers, the Julian of Norwich, the shamans of the world, actually, traditionally, the sort of shaman had to suffer. They had to sort of fall terribly ill, didn't they? They had to go through some horrendous experience to come out the other side, to then be the outlier, to be the mediator between the village and the outside world in some way. But, we only have a few of those individuals, but in our own experience, it's offering some suffering, isn't it? Some loss. Yeah. Bereavement, end of a relationship that turns us maybe towards the mystical, turns us to ask bigger questions. Don't necessarily keep it up, but those times are often times of opportunity, aren't they, to get bigger.
Being a shaman would be, it sounds to us like an amazing thing. It would have been a curse, I think, in most traditional societies, to have that burden, and then to go through the kind of training that was required, which was extensive. It lasted many years and involved a whole lot of suffering, but you were serving a purpose for the society that you were from. So, we can, you can do that in different ways. The suffering, I mean, a lot of people are very concerned with, fasting by being hungry. That's something, but it doesn't really get close to what some of these medieval characters were up to, which was,
living in small boxes like anchorites and
right, living in small boxes, living off, hawthorn bushes and drinking milk from their own breasts or whatever it might be. So that sense of absolute discipline and a kind of hostility to the body is hard for us to swallow. But the movement of the flagellants,
Right.
it's not clear how it begins, but flagellants appear in places like Umbria in Italy, and this catches on like wildfire. And before long, you've got crowds of people turning up outside churches beating themselves, and what is that about? That's not the kind of creatures that we are. Yeah, we could talk about the emergence of, say, cults somewhere like the United States, where you've got this surface layer of the republic and its institutions and the Constitution and some kind of god floating above the scene. On the ground, you've got 100,000 different fantastical, weird, mystical cults doing all sorts of things. And that's what's genuinely exciting about somewhere like the United States, the contrast between those two things.
On the subject of pain, self-inflicted or not, which, strays into the area of pleasure, of course, there's a close link. But also we talked about rock and roll, and maybe we could also talk about sex and drugs, because pain isn't the only way, is it, to ecstasy? Pain isn't the only way to the mystic. There's been the tradition of pleasure. You talk about the Song of Songs, this incredible text, which is about sex, or the sensual, the erotic anyway.
About the erotic, for sure.
Reminded me of the sculpture by Bernini in Rome, The Ecstasy of St. Teresa. Certainly to modernise, it looks like she's in the depths of orgasm, and there's an angel standing smiling above her, pointing the way almost that this is the other route, not to be forgotten, which it's been repressed at times, but isn't that the other route maybe to the mystical, is through the physical, through the embodied, through pleasure.
Absolutely through the body, and then the combination of pain and exquisite pleasure, which is what Thérèse Raveler is feeling, what she reports herself feeling, and how she's depicted in Bernini in that almost pornographic way. And the Song of Songs, within all the Abrahamic traditions, is absolutely central. Sufi, mystical traditions of Jewish mysticism and Christianity. It is an erotic love song between a young woman and a young man, which is where the main protagonist is really the young woman, and it's full of fascinating detail. The young woman is longing for the young man, and clearly something has been consummated, but this isn't done in a language of direct physical description or pornographic description. It's done in a language of simile. His belly was like a stack of wheat, or her hair, it was like the goats streaming down Mount Gilead, or whatever.
Here is a sidebar about the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs, also known as the Song of Solomon, is one of the most extraordinary enigmatic texts in biblical literature. It's a passionate celebration of human love, sensuality, and intimate connection that has captivated theologians, poets, and mystics for centuries. It's composed as a series of poems, and it's like a dialogue between two lovers, typically interpreted as a young woman and a young man whose passionate expressions of desire transcend romantic love. Lovers are compared to gazelles, to vineyards, to gardens in bloom. The beloved is described with intricate, sensuous details. Her hair like a flock of goats, her teeth like newly shorn sheep, her cheeks like pomegranate halves. These aren't just decorative descriptions, but profound expressions of attraction, appreciation, and spiritual connection. The beloved is a sealed garden, a spring enclosed. Metaphors that suggest intimacy and erotic potential. While the text appears on the surface to be a celebration of romantic love, religious traditions, particularly the Jewish and Christian mystical traditions, have interpreted the Song of Songs as an allegory of divine love. But the remarkable aspect of the Song of Songs is its radical affirmation of love as a sacred experience. It celebrates physical, intimacy as something fundamentally holy. Erotic passion is not presented as an experience to be controlled or denied, but as a manifestation of creativity and connection. And unlike many ancient texts, the Song of Songs gives significance to female desire. The woman speaks openly about her desires, pursues her lover, and describes him with the same passionate language that's usually reserved for men. This made the text revolutionary. Love is presented as a mutual, reciprocal experience where both partners are active, desiring subjects rather than objects. Psychologically, it speaks, and that desire itself can be a pathway to transformation. In other words, all you need is love.
But what we find in all these experiences of, say, music and sex and intoxication, these are experiences of surrender. And surrender is very interesting to me. That what is it to give yourself over to an experience and not to try and contain and master it, but to really to undergo something. And I think music, erotic life, intoxication are incredibly powerful forms of surrender. That could just be a selfish wish to enjoy yourself, but can also be a way of, undergoing something which opens you to somebody else, to the possibility of love. The point of the Song of Songs is that this is a love poem. And it's that love poem that then gets transposed into 1,000 different interpretations of it.
Because the intoxication of love, erotic love, or, those kind of passions brings us to drugs. And for many of us, drugs have been a sort of short circuit, or can have been a short circuit to a mystical experience. And particularly in terms of, the classic counterculture, of the, say, 60s and 70s, LSD, mescaline, various forms of mushrooms, opened people up to the mystical, people who'd maybe not had any inkling that way previously. And they still do, in recent times, ayahuasca. The sort of third part of the trilogy of rock and roll and sex is drugs. And yes, of course, most times they're taken just for pleasure, nothing wrong with that. And they can be very dangerous. We have to say that, of course. One of the reasons they can be very dangerous is because they can open you up to the mystical.
I agree. It's to be used with caution. But drugs are ways of overcoming inhibition. So certainly when I was a dirty punk in the late 1970s and was doing far too much amphetamines, what that was about was that suddenly you felt connected with people. And it was that. And that's clearly what was happening a decade or so later when MDMA is introduced into the club scene in the Hacienda and all those places, and the rise of the new travelers. And what's at the heart of that isn't so much drugs as an overwhelming need for actual connection. It's inhibition that drives us away from each other and drives us away from ourselves. And these are ways of opening that up.
And I've resisted asking you to pin down, what is the mystical. I've resisted asking you if you're a mystic. But if we had to sort of like drill it down to a couple of phrases, is it around that? Is it around that deep sense of connection through various means?
Experience in its most intense form, being open to that. I mean, Brian Eno has this lovely phrase where he talks about idiot glee, sheer mad joy at the fact of life and the world, and trying to shut down some of the kind of short circuits that we use to inhibit ourselves. And I'm not a mystic. I have had one or two flashes here and there, but I'm fascinated with people that have had these experiences. So the book is about people that are not like me, and that's why I write about them. The thing we've not talked about is that the tradition of mysticism is tradition. The tradition of mysticism within Christianity is a tradition where women have had extraordinary prominence. And, the earliest autobiographies that we have are mystical texts, Julian of Norwich being the first book in English by an English woman. What interests me is not me, right? So I'm interested in these characters and how, and the kind of intensive experience that they have, and then trying to allow that to kind of inform what I'm doing to push against myself and open things up. That's really what I'm up to.
Simon Critchely, thank you very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you for having me at the Bureau for Lost Culture. I'm very happy to spend time with you, Stephen.
Thanks to Simon. I'll put a link to his fascinating book on mysticism, The Experience of Ecstasy, in the show notes. Well, what about you? Have you had any mystical experiences? I've had a few, I would say. I mean, some in more obvious contexts, say ayahuasca journeys, but also occasionally in nature and even in the city. Years back I had what could be described as a kind of psychic meltdown. I prefer to call it a melt-up. It felt catastrophic at the time, of course, on one hand, and I think some of my friends thought I'd gone completely round the bend. But it completely transformed my experience of London, and the city became deeply ensouled, psychogeographic, you might say. Some of that feelings never left me, and even when I got back on the bus, it still felt something very worthwhile, however difficult it was at the time. Thanks for listening. Thanks for contributing if you've written in or shared these stories with others. I do appreciate that. Let's keep sharing. Let's keep listening. Let's keep looking for the mystical in the everyday. I will see you down the road, round the bend, and over the hillsides for more of these stories from the other side, from the underground and the counterculture. Let's finish with some music.